Welcome to Training My Hobby show. In this episode, I'm going to discuss how Ansible can be used to manage AWS S3 objects like buckets and their policies. The main objective of this tutorial is to learn Ansible playbooks to manage the AWS S3 buckets. As part of that, we'll use Ansible community provided AWS S3 module. You will also observe how I organized this Ansible project and how I organized the configuration files, how I imported them into the playbooks or the roles. The whole source code is available in the GitLab. Before we dive in detail into this tutorial, let us establish a context. The context can be assumed as your requirement. In any enterprise application, as part of infrastructure as a code and configuration management design, an architect has multiple tools and frameworks. Since this tutorial is not designed to discuss which tool is better, this tutorial's primary focus is how we can use Ansible AWS S3 module. For that sake, we zeroed on Ansible as the tool for this video, and let us proceed with that. Now, let's understand what is Ansible AWS Collection. To be more precise, what is AWS Galaxy and what is AWS S3 module? Most of you might be already aware AWS provided a SDK by name Boto 3 for Python language. So to access AWS services in Ansible, we need to use this library. How we can use that? Ansible community developed a library and made it available in an Ansible's official hub, or consider it as a marketplace, and its name is Ansible Galaxy. So you need to run the Ansible Galaxy command to install a library developed by the Ansible community, and the library name is community.aws. This community.aws collection internally uses the Boto 3 library. So when you install it, as is shown here, when I install it, this is the screenshot. On your local environment, now you have access to around 50 modules that are available in this Ansible AWS collection. One of the module is AWS S3 module. This module, we will be using it in our Ansible code to manage the AWS S3 buckets as part of this tutorial. Before we jump into understanding the Ansible playbooks and Ansible roles code base and execute it, there are certain requirements are there which you need to do. I assume you already have an AWS account setup created or have an access to an AWS account, and either you have a user, or if it is your personal account, you have created a non-root user in aws.amazon.com. You also need to install in your laptop or in your desktop or in your system AWS CLI. And I also assume you configured a profile in your local environment, which is a AWS profile. For the context of this tutorial, I created a profile with this name, S3 Buckets Security Ansible Project. And this profile is what I'll be using in my code base here. You can create your own profile. How to create that profile and how to install this, all those steps are documented and available in my GitLab account or the code base associated to this video, and here it is. So if you see here in the readme file, all the steps are provided, wherein I'm installing in the requirements.txt pip install, and in the requirements.txt I have provided all the Python libraries required for this project or for this tutorial. All these other various libraries required. So if you run this command by going to this tutorial page and run this command, then you have all those AWS CLI installed. You also need to run this command. You can change the name. If you change the name, then you need to change this value at another location, which I'll mention in the subsequent slides. You also need to install AWS or Ansible AWS Collection, which we discussed just a few minutes ago. All these steps are required before we understand this playbooks and roles code base. In continuation of the prerequisites required for this tutorial, when we executed that AWS configure and have provided a profile, it creates this config and credentials files. Most of you might be aware the behavior of the AWS configure command. So I'm not repeating here because this tutorial is not about AWS. It's about Ansible AWS Collection. It's not about AWS CLI. If you are not aware of how AWS CLI works, I recommend to look into the AWS CLI documentation. Moving on, after this variables or the credentials are configured, the Ansible AWS Collection have different ways how it looks for these credentials. One way is if you have configured these credentials and config, Ansible AWS Collection automatically picks up these values. Second approach is it has provided certain environmental variables which is there in the Ansible AWS Collection documentation. If you have configured these environmental variables, then it will pick up that. But in this code base, I have written a custom approach wherein I created in different variables and loading it from the environmental variables. This way I have more control. So in the code base, I have inventories. I'm using this dev local as the default inventory name, and then in the Ansible all.yaml, I have provided all these variables. Let's quickly look into the some of the variables. Like for example, what is the AWS profile name? This is the default value, what I need to use in my code base, in my Ansible code base. What is the bucket type? These are the tags when I create a bucket as part of this code base, right? And if there are certain AWS playbooks are there. One of the playbook is creating the policies for AWS bucket. So what policies I need to use? All these are the different values. I've given them as the default values as part of this code base. Moving on. Now let's understand this tutorial Ansible project structure. If you see in the Visual Studio Code, I have this folder which is a base folder, which is a Git base folder. Since this is an Ansible project, I need to have a file ansible.cfg wherein I created certain variables where the roles are there, the folder where roles are there, and log path. All these are very basic for an engineer who is aware of Ansible. Now to execute the playbooks, the command is Ansible playbook is the command. Instead of directly using this Ansible playbook command, I have created a wrapper shell script wherein I am setting certain environmental variables, I am reading certain variables and passing them as extra variables to this Ansible playbook. This is exactly what this wrapper shell script is doing. This is again a self-explanatory. So to go through quickly, I have the shell script Ansible setting env.sh wherein I am setting which inventory file to pick up. I have multiple inventories. One is dev local, second one is, as an example, production. So I'm making this dev local as the default inventory, right? In this, I have certain variables which we already discussed when we were discussing about AWS configure profile, right? So this is exactly what the setinv is doing. The setinv is basically reading this file and then creating a log file, reading this host.ini which has the inventories, and then setting all this logs path, AWS config file, inventory file, extra arguments, all those values it is setting, and that is exactly what it's doing. It's very basic and self-explanatory. This is required because I wanted to have some dynamism when I evolve this code base for some other complex use cases. That's why I have written this wrapper shell script. This is what I want to explain as part of this project structure or project organization or code base organization. Now coming to the core stuff, which is executing the playbooks. What playbooks I have? I have 3 playbooks, but in this video I'll be discussing only 2. One is using Ansible. I want to create a hypothetical AWS S3 bucket, or rather an example bucket. That is one playbook. After I created the AWS S3 bucket, then another playbook will go and update the policies of that AWS S3 bucket. These are the 2 playbooks I have developed it. Let's go in detail how to execute these playbooks. First, I have mentioned everything in the readme.md. This is the command how we execute the playbook. Playbook wrapper is a shell script developed by me, which internally has the Ansible playbook command, which comes as part of the Ansible installation, right? And then I'm saying run this bucket create. So let's see what happens when you execute this command. So let's go to this YAML file. So if you go here and go to this bucket create, first I'm saying that this code should execute on this host, Bastion host. So if you go to dev local, and because this is my default inventory, which I set it as part of this wrapper shell script, right? Then if you go to host.ini, I've given this host name Bastion host as nothing but localhost. That means it runs on my local environment. So that is the first thing. So let's go back to the playbook again. So this code needs to be run on the Bastion host, which is nothing but, in this scenario, it is a local host. But if you are running this same code, suppose if you have created a AWS EC2 instance, which in your case is a Bastion host, and if you are executing this command from your local system, which is a local laptop, then this code gets executed on that AWS EC2 host. So you need to provide in the host.ini the IP address of that EC2 instance, public IP address, all those things, which is outside the concept of this tutorial. This tutorial is purely Ansible and AWS collection, especially S3 bucket. Okay. So now what I'm doing, I'm basically setting a fact. What fact I'm saying? Work file location. So instead of passing so many command line arguments, what command line arguments? I need the bucket name, I need the policy file name, I need the region where I need to create that bucket, what is the AWS access key, all those values we need it to create the AWS S3 bucket, right? So instead of passing them command line argument, because we need to pass so many variables, I designed in such a way that I have a file called workflow. I consider it as a workflow file config.json, wherein I provided what is the bucket name, what tags I need to provide to the bucket, and what is the policy file, right? So I'm created a file. So if you are executing this code base, if you check out my code base and executing on your local laptop, you need to change these values based upon your needs, right? Just maybe if you want a different bucket name, different tag name and tag type, you need to change those values, right? So what this So that's exactly what it's doing. Basically, it's setting a variable where is the workflow config location. Then I'm including all the variables that are defined in this workflow file config.json as runtime variables when this playbook is executed. So how it is done? Using include vars and then file and then workflow location. That means this, all the variables defined in this will become as a runtime variables when this playbook gets executed. Then I'm executing this role. What is this role? Role AWS S3 bucket create. So let's look into the role. That means let's look into how this project is structured. So I have a playbooks folder and I have a roles folder. In the roles folder, you go by the single responsibility. In this case, I need to have a create. So I have a create and create task or a create role. And then if you are creating a role, then these two are the standard folders where you have a defaults folder where you have main.yaml. In my case, I don't have any default values, and have the task. In that you need to have main.yaml. This is the standard Ansible setup, role setup, right? So in this, I'm saying execute this. Ansible automatically executes all the tasks defined in the main.yaml. That's the Ansible behavior for a role. So if you go deep into this role, right, first I'm using the amazon.aws.s3 bucket. I can also use just S3 bucket, but for the sake of this tutorial detailed explanation, I have given the full path, right? So this particular module needs certain variables. So these are variables expected by this S3 bucket module. So AWS access key, secret key. If you don't provide, as I mentioned in the beginning of my tutorial, this video, if you don't provide these two variables here, then this S3 bucket either pick up from the environmental variables or pick up from .aws/config or credentials, right? And I'm giving what is the bucket name I want. I do not want to establish policies upfront while creating the bucket. I wanted to create a totally different playbook for the sake of this tutorial, and also from the real production use case administration perspective. After I create a bucket, I want to have a different playbook to manage the policies of the bucket, right? So state present. Present means there are two values of the present and absent. Present means it will ensure the bucket is created. Absent means it gets deleted, right? Then in which region all these values are coming from this workflow. So let's quickly look into this again, workflow config.json. So here I have these values, right, which are specific to bucket. And here I have groups, inventory, developer, all. I have the region, which region. All this, so some values comes from the inventory, which is a common approach when you're doing an Ansible way of development. Some variables comes from the inventory, and some variables comes from the task, and some variable comes from the playbook execution, which either you can provide from the command line or something, or if you can design it something like this, a JSON file, right? So now coming to create, so create S3 buckets. Now going back to the role. So so what I'm doing is basically I'm giving certain tags. I am capturing the output of this module and then printing it on the console. This is exactly what I'm doing it, right? So let's execute this command and see what happens on my local machine. So this is the folder where I have my GitLab code base checked out, and you can see all the files. In this folder, I am executing this command. Ansible playbook wrapper. Wrapper is nothing but, as I mentioned, it internally calls the Ansible, and this wrapper sets the additional environmental variables, additional arguments to the Ansible, and I'm running this playbook. When I run this, when I'm running this, so it connected, and then okay, so okay, fine, there are no errors, and the bucket has been successfully created, right? So now the good thing about this is, if I run this again, it will not throw an error. because it checks the state. That's how Ansible S3 module, Ansible AWS Collection S3 module works. If I run it again, it will not give an error that bucket already exists, because if the bucket is present, it will ensure that it is there, right? So now with this command, the bucket is created. Great. So now let's look into the setting the policies for this bucket. So for that, I created another playbook called permissions management or policies management. Similar way, the way I've done at create, where I'm setting the workflow file location fact, which is the same file here, right? And including all those variables here. The only difference here is I'll go into the task, show that, and then come back to the JSON file. In this I'm using the policy file. You need to provide the policies in a JSON file. So this JSON file is nothing but what are the policies. I created a temporary policies like this, saying that I want this bucket to be publicly accessible only for the read. So that's exactly what I've done, right? You need to change the bucket name if you have given a different bucket name here. So now I wanted to share my experiences of why I have two YAML files here, but in the case of create, I have only one YAML file. The challenge here is the AWS S3 module of Ansible, right? It doesn't have any command or any module specific to S3 bucket policies. So every time I wanted to update the policies, right, I need to run the same command. If you see here, if you see the command here, the same as what I have given in the main, in the create, same, only policy is not there. So see here also the same approach, same. Here I'm giving the policy file. I found out that the S3 bucket does not have another concise command or concise module where I can set only the policy for an existing bucket. That was the challenge I found out. For that reason, instead of going with this S3 bucket module, I designed in this code base a AWS CLI command. So I'm not in this playbook or in this role, I'm not using the S3 module of the AWS collection, which is available in the Ansible hub. I'm directly using the AWS command line as if, how does this AWS command line is available on my laptop? It is because when I install pip install, I installed Boto 3. That means I have the AWS command line available. And where did I install? As I mentioned in the beginning, in the beginning of the code base, you need to have this environmental setup done, right? So this will install the AWS command line. So now coming back to this this particular role, so I'm executing this S3 API, put bucket policy, and you're all aware of that, how to set a bucket policy for AWS S3. So the main intent here is I want to share the experience that if you are using the Ansible AWS Collection S3 module, and if you want to have or design in such a way that the code base should update the properties of the bucket or the policies of the bucket without recreating the bucket or without touching the creation of the bucket or updation of the bucket, then you can use only the AWS CLI command. I just wanted to share that experience. Okay, so if you do the word wrap, so what it is doing, this AWS command, AWS CLI command, S3 API, and this is standard stuff. It's like I'm saying use this profile name, use this bucket name, and this is the policy file name, and store that into a output and print that variable. How I am invoking this? So this is basically what the code you are seeing is basically a role. You are seeing in the roles. policies role, and this is the task. How I am accessing this file? If you see here, update policies, here I'm using import role, right? And AWS S3 bucket policies, okay, and task from. This is how I am invoking this file. So to share my experiences, I'm reiterating my statement. To share my experiences, intentionally I executed the same behavior twice. This code uses the main.aml code because it's using S3 bucket. Here, if the bucket is not there, it will create it and then update the policies. That is not my requirement. But for the sake of your understanding, I created executing twice. So in a typical production environment, maybe you will not have this code. Just for the tutorial purpose, I mentioned it here. Whereas here, I'm saying that, yes, in the same policies role, I have a task file, execute that task. What is the task file name? CLI file. I hope you got a good understanding of subtle difference between this import role, and why I had twice. Again, I mention I have it twice just for you to share the experiences. In a typical production environment code, you may not have this guy. This snippet, you will not have it because this snippet is using the S3 module of the Ansible collection, wherein that module does not have the feature to update the policies independently. It will create the bucket if it is not there and then update the policies. I hope I'm clear in why I have it twice. Behavior is same, it's just the different flavors. Okay. So now let's execute that command here. It successfully executed. So it executed twice. One because one is using the S3 bucket, right? And the other approach is basically using the AWS CLI approach. These are the two differences. This is the CLI approach and this is the S3 bucket approach. So with this, I completed all this playbook roles, right? So I move ahead. This is how you execute this commands, and this is about the roles, and this is how we execute it. I just want to ensure that if you are following me as part of this video, and I want to have this checklist to ensure that before you execute the code, ensure this checklist activities are completed before executing this code. What are the checklists? That you configure the profile and you already have the user which you are using it have S3 write permissions and read permissions, right? And other commands that are mentioned in the readme.md file of this tutorial code base are executed. Execute these playbooks only if it is done. With this, I conclude this tutorial. I hope it is useful and you have learned how AWS S3 module of Ansible can be used to manage the S3 bucket of S3 objects in AWS. Thank you for watching.